All right, sorry folks, you're being recorded, so act accordingly. Good to see you all.
Oh, good morning, everybody. I need a little more response on that. Good morning, everybody. This is one of the last times, thank you, Neva. One of the last times I can start getting people to have to respond first thing in the morning at a class. But I'm really delighted to welcome everybody here to the Flat studio. My name is Dan Spencer, and I'm the chair of Seamus's thesis committee, teaching the environmental studies department for 5 more days. And I also want to welcome my other 2 committee members here, my colleague Neva Hassman, good friend for many, many years in the program here, and also Brian Chapin, who is from the College of Forestry and Conservation and has worked with Seamus on political ecology aspects of the thesis here. So I'm going to introduce Seamus, and then I'll talk a little bit about the process, and then we'll turn it over to Seamus to walk us through his thesis here. Like a lot of our students here, Seamus already had a very impressive background and career before he came to environmental studies here. I just want to mention a few of these things here. He graduated first in his class of 340 students from San Luis Obispo High School, was an outstanding high school athlete, particularly in running. Awards included a 7-time scholar athlete, Farmer Scholar Athlete of the southern section of California, which is a huge area here. And he took those skills, both academic and athletic, to UC Berkeley, where he studied environmental earth science with an English minor and graduated in May 2016. He ran on the cross country and track teams there, was also a scholar athlete winner at UC Berkeley in the Pac-12 conference there. After he graduated, he spent 3 years as restoration coordinator at with the Coastal San Luis Resource Conservation District at Océano Dunes State Park. Is it Oceano?
Oceano.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, my Spanish pronunciation takes over there. Oceano, yeah, sorry about that, too. Prior to that, he worked for a year as a farm manager of the 66-acre class organic orange farm there. And he came into EVST with a teaching assistantship for the Intro to Environmental Science and also Sustainable Communities courses there. In his first year, he was awarded a Brainerd Fellowship that supported summer internship as a restoration intern with the Clarkford Coalition, and his work on Grant Creek there with that internship became the basis of this thesis. He was also awarded a National Forest Foundation Conservation Connect Fellowship, where he facilitated 2 Forest Service forest collaboration groups. He's also completing the Certificate in Natural Resource Conflict Resolution and has worked as a project coordinator for the Center for Natural Resources Environmental Policy. That's just the formal background on Seamus. As everyone who knows Seamus knows he's a man of multiple talents, an incredible musician, an incredible athlete, an artist. He's a rock climber. Later this summer, he and his dad are doing a technical rock climb in Mount Whitney in the Sierra there. So many things here, but Seamus, it's a joy to have you here. Seamus is going to speak for about 40, just a word about our process for those of you who haven't been through an environmental studies thesis, but we have several recent defenders in the audience. If you just defended in this last week or so, raise your hand. I see Amy and Paulina and Emily and Madeline and Devin there, and Max is joining this afternoon. So we have this is a really exciting time in the program to be doing this here. So Seamus will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes on his thesis, which is, you can see his title here is Restoring Grant Creek, a case study of relational dynamics on a degraded Montana stream. And then I'll turn it over to ask questions first to Max's committee members, particularly to Neva and Brian. And then we'll open up to the full audience for questions and discussions on Seamus's work there. After that period, I think Neva and Brian and I will just move outside for a little bit here. We'll let you all stay in here with Seamus while we talk a little bit about his defense and his thesis. And then we'll invite Seamus to join us for any revisions, and you'll be able to enjoy more of the sugar cap mushroom cookies, which I've never had before. That's a first for me as well. And then for those of you who are on Zoom, if you just remember to mute your audio during this time here. So please join me in welcoming Seamus to his defense here.
Thanks so much, Dan. And yeah, thanks so much for being here, everybody. I'm gonna just do some quick technical things. Yeah, really appreciate that intro, Dan, and thanks to the committee for getting me here. I'm really excited to present the work I've been doing for the last about 1.5 years. But I do want to say a couple thank yous first. thank you to the EVST cohort for all the support and friendship and joy that you brought to the process. And thanks to friends here and on Zoom, and really happy to have this Zoom option to share this from afar. And yeah, thank you to my family for just everything. None of this would have been possible without you. Really, I'm not sure if she's here, but it's my grandma's 93rd birthday, and I want to acknowledge that too. So, yeah. And Amy's birthday. Sorry. But yeah, I do want to say, and also thank you to Flat for hosting us here. So I'm going to dive into some pretty kind of heady conceptual territory today, and I want to do my best to walk that through because I think it's really interesting and relevant. But I also, I do want to just start by acknowledging that the relational framework I'm using really is no different from the interconnectivity and the support that I just mentioned, that connectedness between people and landscapes. That's exactly the same. Those are the same terms I'm using. And so, there's a little bit more subtlety to it, but I just hope that grounds it a little bit as I move into it. And I think, as a lot of us have recognized in our own work and in the work going on in the environmental movement today, that there really is kind of methodological individualism and philosophical individualism just is not tenable for the world we're living in today. So that's kind of the stage I want to set for the presentation. I also want to acknowledge that today I'm presenting from the traditional homelands of the Salish, Kalispé, and Kootenai people. And I'm really I'm just grateful to be able to touch on that a little bit today in my presentation. So let me give that a shot. So today for the presentation, I'm going to give a little personal background, kind of walk up the same way Dan did, walk up why I'm here today and what I've been working on, what I'm bringing to this. I'm going to describe the site of study, which is Grant Creek, just outside of town in Missoula. I'm going to spend a good amount of time on the methodology, just so that's pretty clear, because I think that's a big portion of the work. And then move into some findings, some quotes, and some ecological data as well. And then throw it into this kind of concept of restoring. And that's not my own term, but kind of, I just really like it as a illustrative term for talking about restoration in, a creative way, in a way that is grounded in narrative and story and understanding what we're doing. And then I'll touch on some missing pieces and next steps that I see for the process here. And I know a lot of you are currently involved in the process. So I hope to be able to make this useful, not just interesting. So personal background, first of all, I have this positionality statement. This is a portion of what's in my paper, but I really appreciate that Brian, Neva, and Dan all encourage this positionality statement in research, because I think it's so crucial for recognizing place and role. So I'm a white cis male, a newcomer to the Missoula Valley. So all through the process, as as an individual, as a citizen, as researcher, to recognize the perceived and real race, class, and gender, to interpret my role in this place. And that really was, what I brought to this. And that, you can call it bias, but I think it's more about acknowledging that, that role in that place. So, while I'm also new here, and I try to bring with me a sense of humility and learning from everybody up here, I also think there's an opportunity to see this place with new eyes and kind of see those things that could otherwise be seen as static and essential to this place, and see them as potentially changeable, especially when it comes to degradation of the landscape. So as Dan mentioned, I worked for 3 years at the Oceano Dunes, and I'm really grateful for some coworkers for being here today. This is a restoration site that we're prepping. You can see my friend Grant, who's on the Zoom up there in the background, just wondering what we're doing with our lives. No, but we were staging these hay bales as a baffle for wind, while also prepping it as mulch for outplanting. But this restoration project was in one part for habitat, for native plant and animal habitat, and restoring due to long-term degradation of the Oceano Dunes from off-highway vehicle use and other forms of development. But it was also a social public health issue, because the fine particulate matter in the sand was blowing downwind. So there's this kind of combined reason for the restoration project. And as I got more and more involved, and I worked with the rangers, the maintenance staff, the labor crews here, the California Conservation Corps. On the one hand, I was just so excited about restoration. I saw it as a way to engage and really get your hands dirty doing work to repair ecosystems. But then I also began to see it as just kind of caught up in all these value systems, all these different intentions, and just interests and needs. And so when this site ended up becoming this here a couple of years later, this is called Barbecue Flats. But you can really see kind of the fingerprint of all these figures here. So, the hard lines are the fences that are mediating the riding from the plant growth, but they're also, a compromise between the maintenance staff that had to put those fences up, and then the rangers who were thinking about safety, and the biologists trying to find the places that would work for the habitat. So with all of that kind of, the combined values, I just got so curious about how restoration is, a nexus of ideology and practice and multiple worldviews. And of course, this place too has a deep history of Indigenous presence, and it was really interesting to me to see where and how that was included or not. So as I looked to study these things at a higher level, I looked around, at grad programs, and really just came straight to this one, the ethics of restoration focus of this program, due to Dan Spencer's long development of that course and focus. It was just so exciting to me, thinking about restoration at an ethical level. And in that class, which was my first class in my first semester here in the program, Dan walked us through the lineage of ethical thinking coming out of the Western model and phrasing of restoration, talking about figures like William Jordan III, who were just so excited about restoration as transformative to human practice and healing of relationship. And then figures like Eric Katz and Robert Elliott. Katz, who was afraid that it would become a tool of just another tool of dominion, and just, like making parks, or Robert Elliott, who thought it may become a tool for industry to just apologize and, know that they can extract if they can restore in the future. So what is it serving, and where does it come from, are crucial parts of that foundation. He took us to local examples in the Upper Clark Fork, the large-scale Superfund cleanups. Here's a beaver dam analog from the Anaconda Uplands that we got to do. It was a fun day of just simple task, but also kind of complex in the way it held back the snowpack, and also worked as it helped us ground ourselves as agents in that ecosystem. We also traced restoration as kind of at an inflection point of growth. It's really on so many people's lists today as part of a management strategy. And there's the Society for Ecological Restoration, which has a unified definition. And then the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which began last year, is a kind of an attempt to make it a global practice, which is hopefully pluralistic, but also, part of this one unified vision of using restoration to confront ecosystem degradation. And then we also introduced these deeper challenges to the paradigm. What does it mean to do restoration in the age of climate change if your reference sites are slipping out from under you? Or what does it mean for this Western approach to take up all the oxygen in the room yet again, when it's just one practice of many indigenous practices that have been on the landscape for millennia? So there's so much to this question of restoration. I just want to lay that groundwork here. And here's a quick photo of a summary of our work in the beaver dam analogs. So I as I got to know this area here, I soon found myself looking at Grant Creek, and this is a photo from up near the headwaters. This is in the National Forest area, where there's it's near the Rattlesnake Wilderness as well. And this is on the ridge that separates Butler Creek from Grant Creek. And you can see it's really beautiful for one, but it also didn't suffer a lot of the logging and mining impacts of this region. And it really is pretty unique in that way. So in the upper area, it's in fairly good ecological condition currently, but as it flows down through town, and you can see it here in the center of that image, it really hits some serious challenges. And so it flows down and eventually reaches the Clark Fork of the Columbia River. but currently it goes dry part of the year. And a lot of people have dubbed it the forgotten wilderness stream, because a lot of people here in Missoula know about the Rattlesnake Creek, and they love it, and they use it for all kinds of different things. But not a lot of people know about Grant Creek, and that's for a variety of reasons. It kind of disappears. It goes down some side streets, it's tucked behind industrial areas. It's diverted and used as agriculture. And with all of that, it's kind of this untold history of Missoula. And that for one thing just piqued my interest. And then I'll get into that a little bit more further down the line here. But again, I just want to recognize that this is the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. And I have the name here. I'm going to attempt to pronounce it as Niskesum, which is translated in English as Little Wide Creek You Can Cross. And I think that's important to recognize as I introduce these lenses going down the line here. But the situation that really got me interested or aware of this really at all is this polygon on the right, this map of the Swatipkane Master Plan area, which was formerly called the Mullen Area Master Plan. It's an area that the city county engaged in to try to plan for the next 10 to 20,000 people that are coming to Missoula, that we're seeing coming to Missoula. And instead of just subdividing here and there, they wanted to try to do a comprehensive plan for neighborhoods, amenities, and infrastructure. But through that process of public engagement, and there was this interest in restoration of Grant Creek. And I heard about that first. I heard about restoration right off the bat. And that, presupposes degradation. So that got me interested. And it was neat to see a process that was underway, but just getting started. And then as I learned more and more about it, I just saw this need for refreshed framing, more awareness, and I hope to provide a deeper analysis from my place in the university, with the time and the privilege to do so. So I'm going to walk through the methodology a little bit and return to some of those initial concepts. Again, the ethics that describe kind of what are the values we're bringing to restoration. But then I also wanted to talk about political ecology, which is another kind of young field, but also it's fairly diverse, and it orbits around this idea of addressing social and ecological systems as coupled and kind of sites of power and politics. And a really big component of it is addressing the kind of the root causes of degradation. And so that's a really big aspect of understanding restoration and what can be ahead. So I wanted to dive into that political ecology approach. And I also wanted to address, to try to attempt to do decolonizing work. And that's really a call to destabilize dominant narratives and also implement new methodologies. And so that's kind of, that was a part of my inspiration. And I do want to note that as I got involved in this process, I wanted to put decolonization front and center, but I also learned the ways in which it needed to be grounded in relationship. And I didn't have, being new to the area, I didn't have those relationships with the tribes, and the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes would be relevant here. So I knew that I would have needed to do that in order to develop a project that was authentically grounded in the tribal interests. But given that I didn't have that time, I thought, how could I, as a Westerner, as someone raised with largely Western worldview, how could I maybe walk the Western ideologies and methods up to a place of better relationship potentially? And so that was my interest and attempt to, that was what I attempted to do here. And I also have scale here. How do you, pull lessons from the global practice and then provide lessons from this case study, which I think is so relevant to our region and to other sites around the country. But then what do you do with that? If anyone knows me, they know I have a really hard time narrowing my interest down. And I know that was tough for my committee at times, and it was tough for me. But luckily, I didn't have to do too much of that. My advisor for the conflict resolution program, Sean Johnson, sent me a paper at one point, which had this phrase, the relational turn, which is this idea that it kind of picks up on the nature culture dualism, and that being foundational to a lot of the current degradation we see, the ideologies that go into that, and are shown in institutions and even academia. And it talks about how even in academia, even when people are focusing on social and ecological systems, they can often be in their methodology just further serving to re-entrench those divisions. So you can talk about social and ecological as two separate things. And that kind of falls back on these, presuppositions about both, already knowing what social is, already knowing what ecological is. And then in those projects, they kind of bounce off each other and they do interact, and they, maybe kind of like billiard balls, they bounce off each other, but they don't really, they don't always portray the feedbacks that truly, exist. And so that's what I wanted to get to. I wanted to get in between and kind of just take some space from that social and ecological realm that can be just such a binary and seem impossible to heal. So by focusing on the relations, I thought I might come to kind of new understandings. And I got inspired by this threefold project presented by Simon West recently in a paper. And it describes relational approaches as ways to encourage more holistic, dynamic analyses of human nature connectedness. So just kind of portraying what the connections are. More empirical accounts of knowledge production that prompt more situated and diverse knowledges in decision making. And so back to that positionality, understanding where you're grounded in your knowledge, where it's bounded, where it's limited, but then that allowing more forms of knowledge to enter the conversation, and then bringing those into the decision-making process. And then new domains and approaches for sustainability interventions that nurture relationships in place and practice. And that right there is the goal, I think, for Grant Creek for a lot of people in the abstract. But when I'm thinking about restoration, that's a novel sustainability intervention. And the question is, how do you do that in a way that nurtures relationship? And I think by getting to restoration through these relations, we can kind of come to new opportunities and new awarenesses instead of, I don't know, having a contractor from out of town come in and just fix it. That doesn't have the same solution in mind. So I came to these research questions, which two coupled research questions. What are the relational nature-human dynamics in the Grant Creek watershed? And what approaches to ecological restoration do they restrict or enable? So that trying to incorporate the 3 steps of that project. But again, how do you operationalize this? The word that kept coming up for me. How do I do this? As I got more involved in the process, I reached out to the Clark Fork Coalition, and in the summer of 2021, I was lucky enough to receive a Brainerd Fellowship that enabled me to work with Will McDowell and John DeArmond of the Clark Fork Coalition in developing and implementing a riparian assessment. So this was the first kind of pillar of my work and was the start of my deeper engagement. The NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service survey protocol is a combined assessment of multiple ecological indicators. So bank stability, vegetative cover, fish habitat, a variety of other things combined into a score that allows you to just quickly assess and try to move on through that whole creek and score it and point out where and why things are degraded, essentially. So you see this map here with kind of our output, and these green is sustainable, yellow is at risk, and red is not sustainable. So you really see that through this process, we got a more holistic picture of Grant Creek. And I walked with the help of amazing volunteers, many of whom are in the room here, 10 miles of stream. And we ended up feeling that it was valuable to separate them into sort of 4 segments. So segment 1 being Snowball Road down to the interstate, segment 2, interstate to the Broadway, Broadway to Mullen Road, and Mullen Road to the confluence with the Clark Fork. And those were divided up sort of kind of this combined sense of significant barriers, roads and bridges and culverts, and then also dominant land use types between those areas. So those segments became really relevant. But through the process of doing this work, and as my volunteers, coming from different backgrounds, poets, herbalists, geologists, I really was continually reminded that this riparian assessment was a useful and very precise and specific way among many to understand the creek. So, that was a really an enlightening experience, because even while I could see the value of this riparian assessment, I saw it to be kind of inadequate to telling the whole story of Grant Creek. So I decided to try to extend this through qualitative interviews. And over the early part of this year, I interviewed 20 landowners and land managers, 5 from each of those 4 segments, using purposive and snowball sampling. So building off relationships I already had, and then also asking people if there's anyone else I needed to be talking to in that segment. We focus on that land use and the location segment for those, the focus of that sampling. I asked people questions about place, community, and restoration. And I'm just so grateful for that process. That was such a good way to get to know the area and the people here. And I'm just so grateful people gave their time and insight and even food to me during that process. So that was really fantastic. And I, again, used that framework of the segments. And I just want to have a note on mixed methods again before I move into the findings. Mixed methods is an approach, simply just a way to complement different forms of knowledge. So, where the riparian assessment was very precise on vegetative cover and bank stability, the qualitative interviews provided the, wildlife that moved through intermittently, the changes in seasonality, the way it looked in the winter versus, the riparian assessment being a snapshot of the summer. So it was really clear that that's just more information. It's more value. It again opened that door into understanding multiple ways of knowing Grant Creek, and the qualitative interviews really kicked the door wider open, because that just expanded into different backgrounds and different understandings. And then, for this purposes of this paper, it was an attempt to triangulate on the relational dynamics. Again, trying to look in between. What is mediating the relationships? There's a condition of Grant Creek. There are actions people take. How are those two things in interplay? And that's a tricky thing, but I think I use this framework of care, knowledge, and agency from this paper by Simon West and colleagues as a starting point for coding those interviews. So those are 3 things that are interconnected, and they go into stewardship actions. And I use restoration and stewardship action kind of similarly there. So I'm going to give some of my findings here. I started with those 3 themes, and I eventually added 5 more, I suppose. Care is under ethics, and then I use health, knowledge, agency, ethics, experience, community, legal designations, and restoration to encompass all the data. And there were 20 sub-themes under there. And just quickly, I want to say, clearly I divided some of these things up between human and non-human. And you might ask, isn't that just reifying the nature culture split? And that was a concern of mine through a lot of this process. But I think it was also really important to take my participants at their word, the way they split things up. So that was my attempt, that I tried to just take people's statements at their word. And then I included these sections like the links, and that's also kind of baked into the health as well. But the links is where that came out. So it's the way people describe the connections between human and non-human agency. And it's also, it serves to provide a framework for how those things might be connected, even if they're nominally separated. And then, so I'm going to just talk about agency for a little bit about ethics of reciprocity, and touch on some legal designations just to pick up on kind of the more, I guess, kind of foundational aspects of what might come in the future. So these themes of agency and the links, again, a lot of people separated their agency, mowing the lawn, away from the erosion or the flooding of the creek. But other people had these comments like, let Mother Nature take care of it, clean it out if that's necessary. So talking about how this is a connective sense of there's some agency from the creek, and it's interesting, this diffuse sense of Mother Nature kind of as a combined form of agency of flooding, growth, animals. And then there's also this onus of cleaning it out if it's necessary, strategic use of human agency. This classic example, beavers had a different plan. That came up in various places, and that's beavers are well known for being ecosystem agents, but it's really clear here in this statement that it's connected to human plans, that it's not they have their plan, I have my plan. But I think this is one of many quotes, but it shows how management is caught up in acknowledging the agency of the beavers. And then this last quote here, irrigation was excellent when it flooded, which made the ground usable for agriculture and ranching. And I think that's a good example, because so often ranching and agriculture is treated as an action that is imposed on the landscape. Whereas this person's clearly portraying that the irrigation from the flooding, from the non-human agency of the creek, made the ground usable for them. And it also dictated some of their management actions. So it's this sort of like connected and recursive thing, but it's not one or the other. It's not my agency and the creek's agency. So I like that quote. And then back to sort of those ethics and those grounding values. There's some really great quotes that also showed the connectivity between humans and the non-human aspects of Grant Creek. So people said, you take care of your land, it'll take care of you. Another person included that sense of responsibility, saying, I do believe we should give back instead of just taking, talking about water. And then this other person, I included this, and even though human analogies are sort of inadequate for describing a lot of these things, I think it's important to note that not everybody has the language. And, I'm using this kind of novel framework for relational dynamics. Not everyone has the framework for talking about this connection between humans and the land. But I really like that this person was bringing it into the conversation all the same. So a smile begets a smile, using that as an analogy for how they want to treat the creek. So just to touch on this, the legal aspects a little bit, I'll just introduce the Natural Streambed and Land Preservation Act of 1975, which governs the actions that people can take on stream beds. And I just want to get to my notes so I don't butcher this legal aspect with Bradley in the room here. But essentially, the act sets conservation districts up to administer this, what's colloquially called the 310 law, and it allows people to apply for permits to do work on the streams, and it just defines the relevant streams as natural perennial flowing streams or portions thereof. And that's really interesting, because in Grant Creek, there's a whole segment where people have kind of grown up and every single day called it a ditch, not a stream, a ditch. And that's been such an interesting part of this process, is understanding not just the perceptions, but the legal underpinnings for the difference between ditch and stream. And
oh, that's the ginger, but I think I've got lemongrass.
Sorry, I got a mute, if you would, please. Sorry.
I don't think I do.
Okay, so with Grant Creek, the Missoula Conservation District has jurisdiction, or has assumed jurisdiction over portions of Grant Creek. There are portions that flow perennially, interestingly, in the upper part of the watershed, and then also down at the bottom, which is an interesting part. There's a portion in the middle, which actually is only full of Clark Fork water for a portion of the year, until recently, in which during which the Flin Lowney ditch had previously filled the Grant Creek channel during the summer to allow for irrigation. And currently they just closed the head gate that allows water from the Clark Fork to flow into the Flin Lowney ditch system. So it'll be really interesting to see what's ahead for that. But going back to the data here, people really just said it's been a ditch for a long time, so we don't think anything of a ditch, right? Talking about the way that the condition of the landscape, the way the creek looks, the way people act to it, then returns and mediates their experience and the actions that they will proceed to take in the future. So again, that's a really important relation for a lot of places here on the creek. And then this person also described how the county decided they wanted to protect the fish and the integrity of Grant Creek. And then all of a sudden there's a shift in verbiage. And in that shift in verbiage is a shift in people's mindsets too. Talking about that same relational dynamic, but describing a point in Grant Creek's history where the conservation district or the county assumed responsibility for the ditch as a stream and kind of deviated from this person's experience and their understanding of the creek. So I think that's really important to talk about the legal praxis in all of this, the way law touches down on the ground and is also mediated by experience. And so I think that's just an important part of this story as well. And I'll get back to that, I think, through the next steps. But before I go much farther, I want to throw it back into the concept of restoring. I want to start with this quote by one of my heroes in this kind of work, Donna Haraway. In a recent work, she says, "It matters what thoughts think thoughts, what stories tell stories, what knowledges know knowledges." And she's kind of playing with language, but I think it's really clear that through the positionality statement and some of those other kind of grounded knowledge portrayals that I've tried to do, it is really important to acknowledge where you are when you start to tell a story, what story you're using to mobilize action. And so as we talk about what's ahead for Grant Creek, what restoration may very well be part of the story, but I think we really need to be clear about what stories we're weaving into that thread ahead. So I just want to give a quick, do a bit of discourse analysis on this, and this is one of the political ecology approaches I used. This is just a great sign. I could analyze this for a long time. This is right near Grant Creek, actually, and it's almost beyond irony, but it's it says, Northwestern Energy says, "Restoring our waters and habitats to works of art." So in that statement, you see so many things. You see you see this undefined community. You see works of art, and here this is actually a painting. Purely aesthetic, just looks beautiful. Notably, no humans, neither settler impacts or indigenous presence in the landscape. And then also you get this sense that Northwestern Energy is kind of apologizing up front. Like, as long as they restore, I'm not saying that they're responsible for anything specific. I don't have that with me today, but I think it's clear that if you're running a pipeline through an ecosystem, if you're saying you're going to restore it after, you're kind of covering that up. So there's just so much to that, and it shows how the language we use is so important to what we do, and it really does bear out on the landscape. And so I have the Society for Ecological Restoration definition here, the more recent one. It says, "The process of assisting the recovery of a degraded, damaged, or destroyed ecosystem to reflect values regarded as inherent in the ecosystem and to provide goods and services that people value." So it's a more recent attempt to try to connect the human interests with the ecosystem. But I also ask people colloquially, how do they think of restoration? So this person says, "Successful restoration is bringing it back to how Mother Nature originally had it as much as possible." Again, a pretty well-rounded common definition, but it also gets to that question again, what is this diffuse Mother Nature that we're talking about? And also, what is the leeway that you allow yourself in as much as possible? And also, what is the original place that you're restoring to? So again, just restoration is so densely caught up with values. And I just think it's so important for, as we talk about restoration on Grant Creek, to be grounded in those values and just not gloss over that restoration sounds good, putting it back. That's a really common thread in a lot of this work. And here's just kind of for fun, the way that my algorithm that transcribed a lot of my work tried to translate Grant Creek, and there's some really funny ones in there. But I it's part joke, but it's also it's a way of pointing out that language is often so much more contingent and fluid than we allow it to be. And I think it's important to recognize that as these conversations play out, that were coming from different viewpoints. And, whatever, that's enough about that. Regret Chris. I like Creek. So to get a little more serious here, and try to work towards the next steps, another frame that I just was undeniable at a certain point, the colonization and environmental degradation. So as I learned about Grant Creek through my two sources of data, and then as I also did more historical analysis, it became very clear that there are particular ways that people talk about, especially restoration, but the history of Missoula and the history of the environmental degradation here. So, this person said the history of the area is all ag, right? Conversational, but really truly bounding the area as, 150 years of, obvious thousands of years of history, beyond even human history. So just that as a starting point changes the way you approach how you understand the degradation and how you understand what can be possible ahead. This person also said, I think it lost its identity a long time ago. It was probably Grant Creek, but it lost its identity when they rerouted it and used it for irrigation. And I liked how that person was trying to work through the sense that how we understand the creek changes, how we treat it, but it is still bounded in the sense that it's Grant Creek. It's this English phrase for a stream, and it's still implicitly binding it. And of course, as I mentioned, this was originally called by the Salish, which I'm going to keep working on. And I want to acknowledge too that even my approach here, the property ownership, the landowner, land manager framework that I use has a significant bias. And that's something that I still think has a lot of value in the conversation, the people who own property right along the creek. But it can't be denied that, through the history of dispossession, violent dispossession, and the Homestead Act, and the development of private property on this landscape, this is creating a conspicuous absence of Indigenous ownership or presence on Grant Creek. And so I want to throw that in there and talk about how really that's kind of the front edge of my work. And even though I think there's a lot of value to what I've gained, that's where we need to move. So I want to ask this question: what is Grant Creek's story? As we talk about restoration or whatever might be ahead for restoration for Grant Creek, I like this quote here. This person saying, "Now its role has changed," referring to the change from agriculture to subdivisions to more development. I think we need to embrace that and change Grant Creek to a new entity. It's like stuck halfway in the past and half in the future, not in either place. Give it a life, a real life. And you see a lot of things in there. You see the agency of the creek. You see the need for the agency for that interplay between humans and Grant Creek. And then you also see the interest in talking about the past in conjunction with the future, and telling a story through those things and making it connective to the deeper history of Grant Creek. Not just new entity may risk saying, I just want it to look like a park. But I think if you really go into that past and future conversation, you kind of feel the need to connect the story. So quickly, I want to just get to some of these missing pieces and next steps, because as heady as that got, I really hope it's valuable and relevant to the people who are doing this work today. So I have a series of public process recommendations, and these are some of a series of others. But quickly, I'll just go through, develop relationship with the tribes and talk about what this would mean to them from the start, and build that authentically out of those relationships. So I guess I'd say, back up and say, not just for the utility of talking about restoration, but developing a relationship that would enable that in the first place. Educate the public on the environmental history of Grant Creek. There are lots of ways we tell stories. I was really grateful to see the Grant Creek Trails Association working with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes to develop some signage on the upper parts of Grant Creek, which tells a little bit deeper of that story. But I think there's still a lot of gaps in the story that people are aware of in town. Engage the public through a collaborative process. That's currently underway. There is a nascent collaborative process being helmed by the Clark Fork Coalition that's convening people. And it's difficult for people to find the time to get involved, but I think hosting a really meaningfully open-ended process is really important. And I think that will help people build a community narrative of restoration, acknowledging the values, coming to some form of consensus about them, and then telling that story all the way through. I also think I want to mention that clarifying guiding values and conditions that go latent in public governance and in pragmatic governance, I've called it. Often, just the simple act of saying, "Oh, there's a house here there. We can't restore it there." That may be obvious, and it may be the case, that can't be changed back. But I think so often public officials and other technical advisors don't give the public the credit of saying, we are not restoring it to its former channel because we've developed on it. And I think just saying that phrase changes what you give the public to imagine. I think you just can't preclude the possibilities of restoration by saying, "Oh, there's train tracks there." There weren't train tracks there 200 years ago. How might we do things differently if we were to recognize all of the reasons we're doing, we're building this story. I put this here: engage the discretion of the Missoula Conservation District to potentially take jurisdiction over the stream, but I think also foundationally develop understanding in the community of the legal designations and the importance that those have on the stream. And then engage best practices and share lessons with the larger field of practice, the Society for Ecological Restoration, and potentially the national and global scales. Quickly, I'll just go through my need for further study. Restoration and climate change. This question is huge here in Western Montana. We got lucky with some of these late rains, but we're already seeing impacts. And I think this hasn't yet really entered the frame of the conversation. Collaborative restoration. How do you incorporate a broad variety of viewpoints into restoration? This is a really interesting one. And if I were to do a second thesis, this is what it would be: the interface between environmentalism and the politics of homelessness. And I've been really troubled by some of the phrasings that I've heard through the process here. The phrasings of clean up the riverbed and just run homeless people out in order to restore. And I think it's such an important interface that's not really being connected currently in town or in academia. Continue to think about decolonizing restoration, not allowing it to be another tool of dominion and exclusion and marginalization. And then just continue monitoring and reflection. And I'll wrap it up there because I've been talking way too fast for too long. And here's a photo just as a thank you to my family for surveying with me this summer. Well, this was in 1880s, back in the day. No, but it's been such an amazing experience, and so grateful for everyone's support for allowing me to get here. So thanks.
So much, Seamus, for that presentation. Yeah, Seamus has got a 142-page thesis here, so he had to select and choose what he was presenting there as a really thorough effort on this here. I'm going to open it up to Brian and Eva here first. Brian, you want to start us off with some questions on this?
Sure. Thank you, Seamus. I really appreciate it. I most appreciated reading your what I would describe in certain sections as masterful articulation of some of the reflexive you have around this relational turn and your empirical evidence collected both in qualitative and shall we say pseudo-qualitative stream assessment work. But anyway, I really enjoyed it, and I have a list of questions I won't ask all of, but I think that the depth of and the detail of the questions that I have really speaks to how you were able to engage me in the thesis. So thank you. It's really good. Well done. I think the question I'll ask for I think is benefit the audience here today too is one of the biggest challenges for the restoration enterprise and the academic exercise of restoration, ecological restoration, is this idea of a baseline. You talked about it a little bit already, but I'd like you to expand on what the relational approach illuminates about a baseline, because I think that can be really beneficial when you think about how your thesis then reflects to something like the SER, right? And folks that are practitioners that are doing restoration, both from a decisional perspective and from an applied perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And for those on Zoom, the question was about how does the relational approach affect the idea of a baseline in restoration? We got most of that. I mean, that's such an important question. I think the word still is restoration, putting back. You know, that's the word that people hear and they think about. So it has a lot of power in that way. But then we're moving into this place where the baselines, as I mentioned, with climate change are changing. And then also the baselines are so caught up in the values and what boundaries you put around the history you're telling. And I think there's this understanding as a foundational piece of the relational approach that the world is, you know, always in flux, you know, and that's so difficult for a restorationist when you're trying to just stand anywhere. But I think for me, the biggest power of the restoration of the relational approach in this is just telling more stories and then coming to terms more clearly with the values that are going into those stories, and just you know, whether it's you know, diving into the archives and finding out exactly where Grant Creek used to flow, or talking about the processes that changed it from here to there. I think it's more about how we're going to live again with the creek and coming back to relationship with the creek in a way that's not like, you know, not just managerial. You know, there's many ways to come back into relationship, but in a way that just more fully acknowledges the I think the history is so important, and then the values that people are bringing. And I know that's not a really technically useful, like that's not going to go and help the board of supervisors decide exactly what to do. But I think understanding that even if we're not telling a story, we're telling a story. And so, you know, putting it back is not going back 100 years. It's putting it back now to a place it was 100 years ago. And just understanding that, you know, yeah, I think I'm rambling a little bit, and you can tell this relational approach kind of gets you in circles. But telling the story really, I think, illuminates in what relation we're currently in and how we might move into better relation with it. So I'm gonna leave it there for the purposes of restoration.
James, let me just say one thing further about that, because I find this so interesting. But in your paper, you talk about just one example. Maybe just talk a little bit about what the Salish name for the creek actually suggests about should be used as a baseline.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, you know, and I won't speak too deeply on it and make any conclusions, but the translation is what's that? Yeah. Oh, for those on Zoom, the question was, what is the Salish name, Little Wide Creek You Can Cross in English, suggests about the implications for restoration? And so, you know, as we were doing this study, there's a geomorphological component of the riparian assessment, and there's stream channel forms that you'd expect at different places in the valley. And at certain points, we were saying, oh, this is way narrower than you might expect at this place in the valley. And that was well before I knew anything about the Little Wide Creek You Can Cross, which I think suggests, you know, some people are thinking it suggests a little bit more of an alluvial fan character, as it comes steeply out of the Grant Creek Valley and then opens up to right about where you turn to Snowbowl, and then again as it comes out to the wider Missoula Valley. And I think, you know, in that statement there's the physical characteristics, and then there's the idea of you know, living on the landscape and crossing the creek. And there were, you know, Salish bitterroot harvesting encampments and encampments on the trail to the Buffalo, through that area too, right by the interstate. So I think all of those things are, yeah, really illustrative and kind of get you thinking. I'll hesitate to make too many conclusions just because I haven't, you know, done much more direct research with that.
Ask a question. Thanks, Seamus. That was really good, and it's really rewarding for me to see that you picked up on this project. The need for more research on Grant Creek based because of the split the cane plan, and you know, I'm really hoping that the whole thing will really happen at some level, and it looks like it will, and that's cool. And hopefully your work will, I'm sure it will contribute to that. So kudos to you for doing relevant research and also trying to, you know, push yourself in terms of the larger intellectual and academic concepts. My question for you is, where did you really have to push yourself on this project? What challenged you the most, and how did you overcome those challenges?
Thanks. Yeah. For those on Zoom, the question was, what parts of this project did I push myself the most, and how did I attempt to overcome those challenges? I think, the one, to the extent that I was able to explain really much of the positionality and the decolonizing framework, I mean, that's just that's been a really deeply important question for me during my whole time here at the University of Montana. And I think that was just so challenging, thinking about the political necessity of work, but also the importance for the real grounded relationship that I didn't have. And so I struggled for a while about understanding how much to include, how to frame it, how to connect these aspects, because I was kind of walking into this way of doing it where I could have easily seen myself creating a technical report about the conditions of Grant Creek, and then feeling like there's this conspicuous absence and that I'm leaving behind yet again. So that was a big one. And I think I tried to do that by just taking in by the positionality statement and reflecting on that through the process. And then also thinking about kind of how to tell more grounded stories and how I'm actually interacting with those concepts. Just be more forthright and transparent about that process. And then another one was really too many interests and not enough time. I mean, that's just continues to be my issue. And I think, I went about through the mixed methods process, went about rediscovering why people made disciplines in the first place. It's hard to talk about everything, it's hard to talk about interconnectivity. And I still think that's something I want to try to do, but it's really, really difficult to do that. And I think that's the challenge of interdisciplinary programs like this. It's a really foundational challenge to the way we've siloed things. And it makes it really hard to do and hard to talk about, and using the language that we've been raised on and all those things. But I think it was kind of about committing to it and then seeing where I actually found my footing. And some parts of today, I got myself in knots, but I think through a lot of this process, just talking about trying to, at every step of the way, discovering the value of crossing disciplines and combining things. And that was really important for me. And I think I feel a little bit better about trying to do it in the future. Yeah.
Seamus, I drank too much tea, so
Okay, no worries.
You would just keep it, so there you go here for a second.
Great work, Seamus. This was awesome to see what you've been working on the last 2 years and see it all put together. I'm curious, as you mentioned the UN Decade on Ecological Restoration. You and I have talked about the restoration economy and all the money that's going into this now. First of all, does that worry you, or do you see that as an opportunity? And secondly, how do we ensure that someone who's doing your kind of work is a part of that process, so it's not just heavy machinery and rebuilding creeks?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I think there's some really amazing work not being done academically on political economy of restoration, not enough. As it becomes this thing on everyone's list, it's on one level really great to see people have this focus, but will it bear out? Will it be durable? All these questions come up about your approach. And I think I came up here largely because I just didn't hear an ethicist in the room with people talking about, the conversations would go so quickly from planning what we want, reduced invasives, to support a small population of plants. They would so quickly get funneled into, well, how should we put the herbicide out there? Should it be helicopter? Should it be, hand spraying? And I just think you need that time and space to zoom out. So I think continually there's a concern that there's not enough people giving practitioners space to think about the reasons they're doing things. and just funneling it down to expediency and efficiency. And then also, again, it's this concern that that large companies like, I think you experience this a lot with sustainability metrics and carbon accounting, when it's like, I see Google is net zero. Like, I don't know what that means. It doesn't give people a better sense of what's going on. So I think for me, a big portion locally here is that it's connected to the community, and that the community through the process grows an understanding of what's going on. And I think that's being done. People are telling those stories, but as you mentioned, the contractors just zipping in, zipping out isn't, for one, building capital in the local economy. It's not local hires. And then it's also not allowing people to engage more deeply, which I think the relational approach asks us to do. It asks us to engage more deeply and commit to the places, before, during, and after the restoration project. So I'll kind of pivot from your question that way, I guess. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, Vicky.
Two thank yous and a question. The first thank you is for organizing and going together and organizing such a wide variety of information and talking about a new framework for things like watershed restoration plans. We know we need watershed restoration plan here, and for it to maybe go beyond what past watershed restoration plans have done. Although let's not make it take too much longer, because we really need the money that you get once you have a watershed restoration plan. And second, I want to thank you for you've come down and helped with what I am calling floodplain reciprocity down by the river, or some call cleanup. I guess I like to say about floodplains that they're, especially the 1-year floodplain, that they're a nice place to visit, but you definitely don't want to live there. And it's not good for the people there, and it's definitely not good for the river. And as you know, we've been hauling away hazardous materials by the truckload from the riverbank. The river's rising, and there is another cleanup day this Friday for those who have missed it so far. And I guess what I'm thinking that once there is this park-like area along Grand Creek, it could start having encampments too. Do you have any thoughts about how you might avoid having that problem happen there?
Well, so the question on Zoom is how do we, I'll summarize a little bit. How do we handle the encampments that we've been seeing on the Clark Fork in the context of the restoration of Grant Creek and potentially parkland? Well, I think, again, as I mentioned, I'm kind of just getting more, wrapping my head around the intersections of homelessness and environmental restoration. And I came up from California, where I saw, people living in the willow thickets as I was collecting seed at the state park, and I'd see CAL FIRE, running people out of the riverbed for risk of fire. And I think in just those cases, it's so poorly addressed. There's growing awareness that there's an extreme housing crisis in Missoula. There's also just a crisis in mental health that's continuing around the country. And I think when you're talking about restoring so that homeless people can't live there, you're not addressing the root causes of the homelessness. And I think, people cleaning up the Reserve Street Island, I'm so new to the area and so new to the situation, but I can see that people not living there is not giving people homes. It's not allowing people to live anywhere else. And so just, basically using restoration and the fear of some trash, yes, but not, they didn't, I don't know, I don't want to go too deep on this, but I think it's really important to recognize what problem you're addressing. And it's really clear to me that restoration as a narrow concept of picking up trash is not addressing the issue of homelessness. And I think that needs to be addressed more directly.
Good job.
Thanks.
You and I have talked a little bit about what it feels like to be in a restoration project when you're actually like standing in the creek and surrounded by participants and people who are working together. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how your ethic, or the way you approach ethics, has changed from your first class to now, but not so much the theoretical approach to ethics, but like when you're actually out there and you're like holding plans that you're pulling out, or whatever it is that you're doing that's hands-on, like how you think about ethics when you're in the creek and how that's changed since you first got here.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the question was about how my kind of hands-on direct approach to ethics has changed through the course of my time up here. I mean, I kind of just got tuned into the ethical approach in my undergrad, and then saw the way that, even the amount like how gentle your hands are on the plant as you collect seed is an expression of ethics. And I was so I'm continuously trying to see how my actions can reflect an ethics, and then also discover the ethics that your actions kind of create at the same time. And I think up here, as I kind of have dabbled in recreation, surveying, and some sort of loose restoration projects on Grant Creek, I think for me, it's about recognizing the continuity of your presence when you're switching the way you're acting on the landscape. And that, I don't want to kind of be too grandiose, but like, you can always be a restorationist, in a certain sense, that you can always be thinking about those ethical implications of your actions. And that's not about scolding yourself at every step. It's more about, recognizing your presence. And I think through the process here, it's been about that, and also about recognizing the multiple ways of knowing and multiple ways of acting on the landscape. And that's been really huge for my growing understanding of ethics as a discipline. And so, yeah.
Well, I think there's a question on Zoom.
Yeah. Sarah Halverson asks, what are your thoughts on meaningful ways of sharing your results? The story of your study, so to speak, with community members involved, e.g. landowners, tribal communities, planners, etc.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think, this paper is super long, and I don't know if anyone's going to have the time or interest to read it. But I was really concerned, as interfacing with landowners and certain agencies, I wanted to make sure that this is not just an academic exercise. And so, Vicky mentioned trying to just combine the knowledge that's out there, the information. So I have like a resource list of all the studies, even just like the small aquatics insect studies that I found on Grant Creek. That's all in one place now. I tried to do a story map of my entry into the indigenous history of Grant Creek. And I have sort of a set of recommendations, and those are my best attempts at the moment to address that issue. But I hope to keep thinking about what else I could do to kind of raise that awareness locally, and whether it's speaking at city council meetings or giving presentations at this nascent collaborative group. I want to stick with it and continue to try to refining my ability to share those stories in different settings. Yeah.
I'm curious, as a newcomer to the Grant Creek neighborhood, I thank you very much. I've been trying to learn about the landscape and the people, and so I'm curious from your research, what's, and all the stories, what do we need to do for all the newcomers? I mean, this changing constant dynamics in our current society, where, we know that the relationships that a kid had with the creek led to some marvelous environmental movements, So it is those relationships and knowledge of an appreciation of the landscape that allow us to then envision what we want in that landscape, or mourn what's being lost. So for newcomers, or at least for not only newcomers, but we've lost that relationship perhaps with what we think should be there.
Yeah.
Maybe. So what did you
learned through this, through your conversations perhaps, about opportunities for building those relationships that might lead to restoration?
No, that's such a good question. And that's, as I mentioned, that's a front and center with a lot of conversations in Missoula. And this is, you know, again, all of my work here just connected me to what's going on in Missoula. And, you know, the historical growth of Missoula and the current growth of Missoula, these different waves of people arriving here have been so impactful for the changing, and it's been borne out on the landscape as well. In a lot of good ways and plenty of not so good ways as well. In the interviews, a lot of people expressed concern for these new residents, for just the fear of this new group of people that's going to develop and pave the landscapes that we appreciate. Then others also expressed that, you know, it takes people from an outside view coming in and saying, hey, why are you running your cattle through the creek? Or why are you, you know, why do you have your horses just down in the water? That's not so good for how we do it, you know, wherever it is. And so I don't want to say outright that that there needs to be a privilege of one over the other, but I do think there's a lot of breakdown in communication going on right now. Just fear of people coming in and overtaking the community, which in a lot of cases is happening. But I think also making sure that we're not so insular. And, you know, I'm new to this area, and I really do believe that I'm here to learn, and I don't want to kind of, you know, have my conclusion about what needs to happen. But I just think it makes me sad, and I think it made a lot of my participants sad when it just gets separated as outsider, newcomer, you know, versus the people who have been here for, you know, even 20 years is not, that's not growing up here, and that's not, you know, that long of a perspective. And I didn't really answer your question. I think it's more about just making sure that the interface is still happening, and that people are still having conversations and not driving themselves apart from one another. I don't know. It's a pretty vague and hopeful statement, but yeah.
We have some time for one more question. Anybody else?
We have a question from Leah on Zoom.
Yeah, you want to read that?
Sure, Leah says, Seamus, this is so educational on so many levels. I definitely share your concern of the actions and dialogue surrounding impacts of restoration / cleanup and people experiencing homelessness. Humanizing the other and honoring relationship / interdependence among human and non-human entities seems central to addressing these challenges at their root. Have you seen evidence of these conversations and restoring as shifting individual perspectives, either in your work on Grant Creek or refugees?
Yeah, thanks, Leah. That's a good question. I mean, I definitely fall into that camp of I think restoration can be transformative, mutually transformative, and can develop relationships. There are some good examples of, like, the Mattole watershed, salmon restoration work. Salmon restoration has been really amazing to see the way people are coming into relationship with fish, recognizing the biology that was obscured by, you know, a singular view of fish, and kind of just experiencing having a, you know, an incredibly powerful, like, being in your hands, or, you know, trying to support their regeneration. But even the crews that I've worked with over the years, the people who, you know, had never planted a plant before their labor crew day, you know, seeing them just take those small steps into awareness of, you know, the living thing in their hand, the care it takes to put it in the ground, and you know, the awareness that, you know, do I put it here, what matters? And that's just an entry into that broader idea of ecosystems as multiple relations all at once. I'll leave it there, just in the interest of not rambling.
Not just one quick question. Well, it's quick, but my question would be quick. I don't, your answers are great. I'm surprised fire didn't come up. Why not?
You know, it did come up in a couple cases. It was part of that. I think I ended up putting it in the non-human agency and the human health aspects of it. Yeah, the Upper Grant Creek watershed, the fire is a big concern partly, you know, the logistics and the infrastructure that's there for fire exit. Some people mentioned fires that had happened on their landscape in recent history, kind of crossing their fingers that it wasn't going to happen in the future, or talking about how they're trying to learn about how much of a buffer to create around their house, and with the wildland urban interface, this new phrasing and new kind of best practices that are coming out. I see that to be sort of on the kind of continuum of restoration and stewardship practices. And I didn't get into how restoration kind of fades in and out of stewardship, which a lot of people raised. But now fire is very, very much of concern in the upper in segment 1. And I think just like with restoration, for fire management, people need to, I think it would be beneficial to think about these relations so that they're not just, you know, paving, you know, the WUI around their house, and they're also not, they're understanding how fires work while they're trying to manage those. But it is definitely a concern.
Do you know if the Salish, if this was one of the areas where the Salish burned traditionally?
I don't know. I don't know personally. I just know that there were certain bitterroot harvesting areas
In the lower part.
in up by there was a bitterroot harvesting camp right by the interstate, and so I think you know, this is totally I don't have the evidence for this, but it suggests that there may have been some cultural burning there, because that has happened for that they would burn for bitterroot harvesting. So yeah, I'm not sure.
James, I'm going to ask the last question, and then I'm going to try to be outside here. But it's hard for me to believe. 2 years ago, just about 2 years ago now, right in the midst of COVID and shutdown stuff, you and I had a Zoom conversation, which we were still considering which program we wanted to go to. And I was so impressed how much you'd already been thinking a lot about ecological restoration and your work, obviously, and you thought a lot about it. You read Bill Jordan's book, Sunflower Forest, and stuff. But I'm just curious about 2 years later now, what if anything has changed about your views of restoration? What have you changed from before, but what have the last 2 years done for you in terms of thinking about now these questions of restoration that you came to the program with?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Basically, you get to the end of one of these theses, as I'm sure many of you know, and really all you can say is that you know nothing, basically. Like that's really how I feel a lot of days. But I also think that
you wrote a lot of pages on nothing.
Yeah, yeah, double spaced it too. Well, I think, you know, on the one hand, I'm just amazed at how restoration is just on everybody's in so many conversations currently. You know, I kind of have been paying attention to it more, while I think it's also been raising a lot more awareness. And I think I'm just more instead of having the right answer, I think I'm trying to coach myself to be more about the process that just enables more of that conversation, and that, I mean, you might call it collaboration or something, but I think it's just it's not about knowing exactly what's right for the landscape, but it's about entering into the process authentically and grounded in your knowledge and recognizing other people's knowledge. And I think through that process, there's a lot of things that'll grow. So I think I'm much more, I've attempted to be much more process oriented than maybe I anticipated coming back and, you know, saying I knew exactly what kind of dune restoration, which I don't, absolutely not. But I think I know a little bit more about how to create space for better conversations about what we're doing at all. So that's what I'll say.
Thanks, James. I mean, I'm actually going to reflect back a few things out here, and then I'll say, but because I think you're in some ways a little too biased on this. You talk a lot about the multiple knowledges, and if I were to reflect back, I mean, you know, one of the things that's so apparent to me in your thesis, and it's harder to see in the presentation when you read through, is how skilled you become in many different dimensions of this. So, like, of course, you took a lead on qualitative methods. This is a really wonderful example of that here. Your work with Brian on political ecology, your political ecological analysis is really strong. The work you've done with Rosalind on traditional ecological knowledge and the native stories, that shows up in here. I mean, there's lots of different pieces. And so when you chose to do a mixed method approach, which is not easy to do, but you're really weaving together some of these different things, and then you take that relational dimension there. And so I think you gained a lot of knowledge.
Thanks, Dan.
You came in already having thought a lot of these questions, but you now produced something that it's not an easy task to pull all these things together. I mean, I've said to you before, you've got at least 3 different projects in here that could easily, each one should stand alone, but you've chosen to put them together in a really interesting and complex way. Good job.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate that.